Started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Swanson. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Waco. Thank you all so much for being here. So our spring lecture tonight is entitled Remembering the American Revolution Through Historic Preservation. And so actually the idea for this lecture came out of discussions on how Historic Waco was going to participate in the 250th anniversary that's happening this year. And this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but Waco was not founded at the start of the American Revolution. So we were kind of thinking to ourselves, well, what are we going to do? And so we actually thought it would be kind of cool to take you through all these historic houses and buildings that obviously had an impact through the Revolution and beyond, but from our perspective, essentially from the perspective of historic preservation. Historic Waco was essentially founded from 3 separate organizations that all came together, but their sole purpose was to preserve one of Waco's historic houses, and they essentially all brought them together. So we thought, tying that into, okay, well, that's just our story. How did all these other houses come together? And it's a lot of similar stories that you see over across the years, which obviously our speakers didn't go into a bit more detail. Every time that we have a lecture, I would be remiss if I didn't thank all of the staff and volunteers of Historic Waco, because again, without the volunteers, Historic Waco, we wouldn't be able to do anything, because it would just be me, and I wouldn't have the time to do any of this. And they're much smarter than me, of course. So especially the volunteers for the education committee, they do a lot of the research, they put all this stuff together, they do all the fun things. If we're ever looking for a fun group of people to learn about Waco's history and put on events like this, please consider joining and being a volunteer with them as well. I also want to thank Brenda Light and the Lee Lockwood Library, because they always let us use this lovely space. And then our sponsor of this event is the McLennan County Historical Commission. So now to introduce our lecturer. Dr. Ken Hafetorpe is a professor of museum studies at Baylor University and an award-winning author on American and Texas architecture and material culture. In particular, he has written on historic houses and churches, painting and sculpture, furniture, and gravestones. He did his doctoral work on the University of Texas, studying with William H. Getzman, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian of the American West, and Blake Alexander, the Dean of Texas Architectural Historians. His subjects have included the Smithsonian Castle, the French Legation and Governor's Mansion in Austin, Ashton Villa in Galveston, the Spanish Governor's Palace in San Antonio, and the historic buildings of Fredericksburg, San Antonio, and Waco. He has also written an essay for the catalog, The Art of Texas, 250 Years, which accompanied the exhibit at the Whitty Museum, and 2 biographical essays for Making the Unknown Known, Women in Early Texas Art, 1860s to 1960s. His book on the material culture of German Texans won the Ron Tyler Award from the Texas State Historical Association, as well as awards from the Victorian Society in America, the Philosophical Society of Texas, and the Conservation Society of San Antonio. Historic Homes of Waco, Texas, an excellent book if you haven't read it, also won the Ron Tyler Award from TSHA. He has spoken at many museums, including the Alamo, the Amon Carter Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and the Whitty Museum. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ken Hafetorpe.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good to see all y'all here. Good to see a lot of friends. I guess we're casual tonight, right? I'm okay ditching the jacket. Semi-casual at least. Oh, one thing that might help would be lower lights.
Yeah, lower lights.
Yeah, can that happen? Just in terms of, you don't need to see me as much as you need to see the images up on the screen. I tend to be a great advocate for dark in lectures. Maybe I'll throw some light your way, but good to see you, and glad to be speaking on a topic near and dear to my heart, historic preservation. And historic preservation wouldn't have much to preserve without the very interesting historic buildings that were related to various epochs in American history. Can you all hear me in the back? Are things okay? Okay, all right, good, thumbs up there, yay. Don't want to be standing here with half the crowd not being able to hear. It's very appropriate to blend these two together, the American Revolution and historic preservation, because so much of the early activity in historic preservation dealt with how do we remember the American Revolution and what are the most appropriate buildings for conserving America's memory of that momentous time, the decision of the American colonies, the English colonies, to decide to separate from Great Britain and to create a republic of their very own. And so that ties in very nicely, and as Eric mentioned, the sort of activities that happened in remembering the American Revolution very much inspired the early activities of remembering Historic Waco. So we'll be keeping those ideas in mind as we take a bit of an illustrated tour here of historic sites. It really kind of struck me as I was pulling together the PowerPoint, and basically, I see this evening's entertainment is a very pretty PowerPoint with some occasional commentary by me. Striking that there are that a lot of the early sites associated with the Revolutionary era are not terribly well known or don't exist in the form that they did at the time of the Revolution. For example, most of you have probably heard of Faneuil Hall in Boston, where many of the debates about whether to separate from Great Britain happen. So if you watch sporting events broadcast from Boston, you might see the modern day Faneuil Hall as sort of going to commercial image with the statue of Sam Adams in the foreground. But it's kind of strange. That building is being from the 1805, 1806. Eric, good boy. Okay, let's give our eyes a chance to adjust for just a minute here. But I think you'll be able to see the images a lot better here. But what's now part of the Freedom Trail and run by the National Park Service, Faneuil Hall, is a greatly enlarged building from the early 19th century. And that makes it kind of a challenge because the building where many of the momentous debates about whether to separate from Great Britain happened in a much smaller, the original Faneuil Hall, which you can see on either one. Thank you, Eric. Was actually designed by one of the earliest American professional painters, John Smyver, who come from England in the late 1720s. And it's called Faneuil Hall because that was the name of the donor. Early example of a wealthy merchant giving back to the city where he made his fortune by essentially creating what was a marketplace on the ground floor. You notice how there was that sort of arcade on the ground floor. Interestingly enough, that's where you now buy T-shirts for the Freedom Trail or various and sundry tchotchkes. So market on the ground floor, but then on the upper floor, a great open hall. And in fact, other than the meeting houses in Boston, Faneuil Hall was the place where people could congregate to discuss these important issues of the day. And so Faneuil Hall was quite significant. And yet at the same time, the meeting houses of New England were also very important places. One thing that I try to drive home to my students when we're talking about material culture and about the material culture of religion in early America is that meeting houses, because they were coming out of the Puritan tradition, were not considered to be sacred spaces. That in fact, it was a house for meeting. The church was actually the congregation. So the first church of Boston referred to the people, not to the doors or the pews or the steeple even. Same thing true for Old South, which you see here, which is kind of an interesting building because the first steeples had actually been built for the Church of England, what we now call the Episcopalians, and apparently the Puritans got steeple envy and decided that they needed to build some steeple meeting houses of their own. And someone commented at the time that actually it looks Anglican on the outside, but on the inside it's still organized like a Puritan congregation, which is kind of hard to tell now because they put in pews that make it look even more Anglican than it did back in the Revolutionary time. But this was the site of a lot of debates about independence. And in fact, this church, which still stands today, was endangered as people were moving out of Boston and moving out into the suburbs, all the way to the Back Bay and places like that. And Old South Church built a new church in the Back Bay, much more fashionable. And so the question became, do we tear this down and put it to some good use? And so one of the earliest preservation controversies in Boston was about saving Old South. And in fact, a collection, the children of Boston started a collection to raise money. I think they raised $20 or something magnificent like that. It was sort of a symbolism that we look at preservation and is it something for people trying to hold on to their memories of some earlier era, or is it in fact something that's a down payment for citizens of the future, the young people, and their children yet unborn. So this was an early example of the preservation movement coming to the fore. And another significant building in Boston in which very few debates took place pertaining to the Revolution was the old State House. And it was a kind of awkward having discussions about revolution when the governor had his office in the building, that being the royal governor who was sent over from London. So you can't really see it on either of these, but there's actually a balcony on the end that's facing down to the wharf, which was kind of the governor's balcony where he or some of his minions could go out and make proclamations to the general public. So this is a significant building, but it's probably significant for what happened out in the street. What was what happened in the year of 1770? This was the site of the Boston Massacre. And the confrontation between some of the Americans protesting what they perceived as to be the overly heavy taxation of subjects of the colonies and being opened fire upon by British troops. So that's what you see in the engraving on the right. And do you notice what's behind in the background there? By golly, it's the State House. And just to the left of that is the steeple of the first church. Or it's really kind of a cupola rather than a steeple, complete with a clock. The interesting thing is this 1770 engraving, which has become one of the classic images of the American Revolution, was actually engraved by Paul Revere. And as you may well know, Paul Revere was, in addition to being a patriot, someone in favor of separation from Great Britain, he was also a silversmith. And let's see if I put these in. See, there's Paul. Hi, Paul. Paul Revere, one of the things that you have to do as a silversmith is to be able to engrave like people's names or their initials on silver, or to carve their coats of arms, so that it requires, a pretty fair amount of physical dexterity and being able to carve. And those same skills actually come in quite handy when you're creating an engraving. So he was someone who was really functioning in a couple of different worlds. And as you all probably know, he's famous in American decorative arts terms, and I say that because I'm teaching that class right now at Baylor. But he's also famous as having taken that midnight ride of Paul Revere, which was to alert folks out in the area around Lexington and Concord that the British regulars were coming to try to confiscate their firearms and their munitions, which did not prove to be a very popular thing for them to try to do. And interestingly, the second Anglican church in Boston, which you're seeing on the screen on the left there, which does actually support the first steeple in Boston, is where Paul Revere agreed that they would hang lanterns to notify people on the other side of the Charles River which way the British regulars were coming. One lantern if by land and two if by sea. And so the poor building's been through a lot. In fact, a hurricane blew off the original steeple, but it's been replicated like the old. And that's part of the historic preservation too, of holding on to these important buildings and important reminders of the past. Paul Revere got a big boost reputation-wise by having Henry Wadsworth Longfellow write a poem about him, the famous Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which has memorialized one of the very peculiar notions that he wrote about on a horse, saying, "The British are coming, the British are coming." And of course, people would listen to that and say, "We're already here, how can we be?" Because everyone in the colonies was a subject of the British Empire. And it was actually the British regulars, the troops, that he was warning people about. So a subtle but meaningful difference there. And this actually is an engraving that Paul Revere did about an obelisk that was erected in Boston under the Liberty Tree, rejoicing at the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1765. That was 5 years before the Boston Massacre. And then he also was the craftsman who created the Sons of Liberty Bowl for that group of patriots who were really kind of driving the sentiment for separation from Great Britain. This is now in the collections of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, which has a tremendous collection of Paul Revere's silver, as well as that portrait of him by John Singleton Copley, which you just saw. To the south, there was certainly agitation as well, and lots of it coming from Virginia. And here is a spot where we see both that sort of revolutionary fervor of the 1760s and early 1770s being memorialized in the 1920s and 1930s by the creation of the organization Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. And Williamsburg had not been colonial since 1780 until it was decided that this organization would be founded by John D. Rockefeller Jr. To take the village back to the way it had looked in the 18th century. That's a pretty complicated task, but the restoration and recreation of Colonial Williamsburg was very important and a very important milestone in creating professional architects, professional landscape architects who knew about historic ways of building and historic ways of gardening, curators studying historic furnishings. And one of the big challenges to that was that two of the most important buildings in Williamsburg were long gone. That being the Capitol building, which had burned multiple times, and the Palace of the Governor. And so it was obvious that it wasn't going to be a very impressive historic site or tourist attraction without those two buildings. So what you're seeing here are two photographs that were taken in the 1930s, let's see, 1935, by Hafetorpe and Lincoln, showing the recreated Capitol building. And so, this is one of those cases where, oftentimes it's quite easy to be, snarky about the Rockefeller family, doing this as out of a motivation of, proving how noble their ancestors were, or the wealthy great white men of the time were. But by golly, the Rockefeller family has spent something like $80 million over the years on Colonial Williamsburg. So that's pretty amazing. Wish they'd spend a little largesse here in Waco. That would be right handy, don't you think, Eric? Just drop a little fragment of that. We'd be content. But there were challenges to this. So you're looking at this pristine building, and actually here's an image of the governor's palace and a photo of the building as it was reconstructed in the 1930s. They actually had to tear down a school building that had been built on the site to be able to take it back to this. And there were some records, colonial records, that had information about, materials that were being ordered, and they got a bulldozer and did what they imagined was archaeology at the time, revealing foundations of the original building. We don't do that anymore, get a bulldozer and call it archaeology, because, they were blowing up all sorts of evidence by, when you want that big footprint is the only thing you care about, you lose just this whole mosaic of other information. But the thing that was so challenging about it is that there were very few images of either the Capitol or the governor's palace. So that you see here on the left, the best image that we have of the Capitol that was built in around 1705 and existed as the Capitol until it burned in 1747. And over the next several years, it was rebuilt in a rather different form, as you can see in the image on the right there. And this created kind of a challenge for the folks at Colonial Williamsburg, because the much better documented building was the 1705 one, much more so than the 1748 to 53 building. But so they went with the early building. Small problem. If you're interpreting Williamsburg as one of the cradles of the American Revolution, and you're talking about the patriots coming together and debating independence in the Capitol, the one that they were actually doing the debating in was the building on the right. And there was extremely little evidence comparatively about that one. So they ended up with the 1705 building. So there's this kind of, if we were in Rocky Horror Picture Show, this would be called the time warp, because it's just, it's just a little peculiar. Now, in our modern day and age where we can do digital reconstructions, by golly, here is it's the Digital History Center at Colonial Williamsburg, which is now able to come up with this sort of color replication of what that building would have looked like with the sort of brick, very typical of the Williamsburg brick. And so, we're now able to generate believable images that can help people to visualize what the Capitol actually looked like in the decade or so running up to the American Revolution. But there were other sites in Virginia as well. We tend to kind of focus on Williamsburg as being the capital of the colony of Virginia. But this is a church building, which still stands, in dramatically enlarged shape. It does survive today, but dramatically enlarged. But this is the Henrico Parish Church, which is now I believe it's St. John's Church, but it's in Richmond. And this is a famous building, not so much, I mean, it's a nice colonial church. The original part of the church, does this actually have a blazer, Eric? Is this top thing?
I think so.
Answer. Oh. What's that on off? Well, basically, on that floor plan, the middle part there, the part that's sticking up at the top and sticking out at the bottom, that's the original church. And it was enlarged quite dramatically in the later 19th century and again in the early 20th century. And it's very famous because basically the colonial legislature was getting freaked out, and there had been reports that the British Army might attack Williamsburg, which was going to be really disruptive for their discussions about independence. So they decided to beat a hasty retreat from Williamsburg up the James River to what was going to become Richmond after the war. And so it was actually in this church building that Patrick Henry got up and gave his famous oration that included the words, "Give me liberty or give me death." And so, and you're looking on the left at a historic photo from the Historic American Building Survey, which is a federal program started during the New Deal, which is a treasure trove of information about early American buildings. So that's from the 1930s. On the right is an even earlier image, which is a postcard. And it's a postcard supposedly showing the interior of the church it's the view from Patrick Henry's pew in the church. That's how they spun this. Of course, everything on the inside has changed by this point. But so it's very complicated. I think you're probably getting the feeling now that, wow, buildings survive, but they've been added onto, and it really changes the character to it. Which reminds us that we do have to be careful when we're fixing up an old church, for example. Especially one where significant events did in fact take place in that building. But then the center of the effort for creating an independent country is Philadelphia, conveniently located in between the northern colonies and the southern colonies and the middle Atlantic colony of Pennsylvania. And the creation of Independence National Historical Park really gets underway in the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. You're seeing two photographs that I was able to snag from the Historic American Building Survey. That's the New Deal program, but it's all available via the Library of Congress. So if you want to see these photos, you can just go to the Library of Congress website, and it's extremely cool. I have a lot of fun there. It's one of my favorite places. And the reason that you're seeing these two extraordinarily rare images is that they are the earliest images that we have of Carpenter's Hall. That being the home of the Carpenters Company. They were essentially the carpenters of Philadelphia and surrounding areas trying to become a guild like they had back in the mother country, and that just had never really caught on very well in America. And so the idea here was that it would be a building for carpenters to meet, to discuss what the proper cost is for various types of buildings. And in fact, they published a little book showing, explaining to people how you should be pricing or what you should be paying for different types of buildings. All of that just to say that they had a really nice meeting space in there. And at the time that the First Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, the Carpenter's Hall was available, but the State House was not. And so a lot of the earliest debates about the Revolution happened in Carpenter's Hall. It still stands, it continued to evolve over the years, but it took a lot of restoration work, and it is now part of Independence National Historical Park. So Carpenter's Hall was where a lot of debates, and there's a floor plan up there, and there's a modern photo, so you can see here it is in the olden days, and here you see it. This is a historic photo that I took in 1983, November of 1983. Oh, I remember 1983. It was a good year. I actually had a research, not a research lead, but a research grant from the University of Texas to work on my dissertation, which meant going to a lot of historic sites in the Northeast. But when it became available, the Continental Congress moved into the State House. It wasn't old yet, but it was the State House. I think it probably became old after the Capitol moved to Harrisburg, and so it's old as in the former State House. But this is one of the best documents we have of the original appearance of what was not yet Independence Hall, but what we all now know of as Independence Hall. That's really a name that didn't come about until the 1830s or 1840s. It was the State House. And this is actually an engraving from a magazine called The Gentleman's Magazine, published in London in 1752, showing an image of the building that was then under construction. So that not everything turned out precisely the way that you see it in this image. It may have been more aspirational, shall we say. This is what we want our building to look like. Trust us on this one. Another important document is this engraving, which is based on a drawing by Charles Wilson Peale, the artist and founder of his own museum, Peale's Museum, who's considered one of those early museum masters. But this is quite good for being able to see the clock that was built into the west wall of the State House, and a three-dimensional view of the tower as built. And amazingly enough, after the legislature departed for Harrisburg, there were a number of uses that the building was adapted to. And that tower was actually taken down. So that a very early American restoration project was in 1828 when the architect William Strickland was hired to come up with something as close as possible to what was the tower and cupola of this building. So again, we think, golly, these have been preserved so well. It's just amazing. They look just like they did in the olden days. Well, maybe. The moral of the story is not, oh, it's all a fraud, it's all terrible, but to say it's a challenge to preserve buildings in their original state, and it's a challenge to get them back to what they looked like at a particular point of its greatest significance. And nowadays, we do acknowledge the dates of greatest significance for this building was the middle 1770s and the debates on independence, and it becomes the national capital in the 1790s up until Washington, D.C. is ready for occupancy right at the end of the 1790s. So it's very important for telling the story of the Revolution, and sort of the story just beyond the Revolution is what happens in terms of creating a constitutional democracy. And that's kind of the shoe dropping after the Revolution says, let's split from Britain. But then perhaps even more important is the creation of the Constitution and a Republican form of government. And as you know, many people felt that George Washington very easily could have declared himself to be the King of America or the Emperor of America, and that he didn't. And that was perhaps the most glorious thing that he did, was to retire to his plantation in Virginia. So just a couple of images of the assembly room, which is the room where it happens, to borrow something, a phrase from the musical Hamilton. And this took an unbelievable amount of restoration work. And all of that was done in the 1950s and 1960s by the National Park Service. And this room had been remodeled, gussied up, improved in all sorts of ways to where it would barely have been recognizable had George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Ben Franklin came back. And so it requires intentionality and it requires a pretty decent budget. I mean, they were never just, awash in money. It's whatever appropriations they could get out of the Eisenhower administration and then the Kennedy and Johnson administration. But they were able ultimately to succeed in making a space very close to what looked like when the great debates were taken on independence, culminating in the vote of July 2nd in 1776. One of the most significant artifacts in this space, and you can actually see it just to go back, in the middle of that back wall there, that is the speaker's chair. So that's where John Hancock would have sat as he was presiding over the debates about independence. And actually, I'm getting a little ahead of the story there, because there was certainly a chair there, but this one was actually not created until just after the Revolution. The date on this, you might be able to see, is 1779, made by a local cabinet maker. And let's see, okay, 1776, oh darn, this chair missed the momentous debate. But it sat through a whole bunch of other things, including the debates about the Constitution, because this was the room where representatives from all of the independent states, the former colonies, got together and came up with the American Constitution. And that if you see, there's actually a sunburst on the back of that chair, as well as a Phrygian cap, a sort of Liberty cap. But there's an interesting reminiscence by James Madison about this chair. And he said, while the last members of the Constitutional Convention were signing the document, the Constitution, Dr. Franklin, looking toward the president's chair, at the back of which a rising sun happened to be painted, observed to a few members near him that painters had found it difficult to distinguish in their art a rising from a setting sun. I have, said he, often and often in the course of the session, in the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was a rising or a setting sun. He was just getting so bored with the debate that he was staring at the back of the chair, and is that a rising sun or a setting sun? But now at length, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. And so this chair is now known as the Rising Sun Chair. Interestingly enough, if you go to Philadelphia and you do the tours of Independence National Park, there's now actually a museum of the American Revolution, and they have created a precise copy of this chair, which is sittable, so that you can actually test it out and see if you think it was a comfortable place to be sitting during those very lengthy debates over the proper form of the Constitution in 1787 and 1788. And this is a somewhat stunning view of Independence National Park. It looks so beautiful and park-like. Wow, they had kind of a nice place to hang out while they were debating independence and debating about the Constitution. And this is actually the National Park Service meets urban renewal. It was actually a very thickly settled area with lots of little buildings, bigger buildings, and so anything that was not present in the 1770s or 1780s was swept away. And so you end up with this kind of strange park-like setting that was not what George Washington or Ben Franklin or John Adams, any of those people, actually experienced. So kind of a cautionary tale in that regard. But another way in which Americans have attempted to hold on to the revolution, the revolutionary ethos, is through the homes of the people who were leaders of the American Revolution. And of course, the most famous of these is Mount Vernon. George Washington, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. Although they used to say about the Washington senators, Washington, first in war, first in peace, and last in the American League. So things do in fact change. But this is quite critical as being, there was a small house, which I think we have loaded up, in New York that was Washington's headquarters for a brief period of time. But Mount Vernon was the first house to be consciously preserved as a historic site. Really, it was one of those that they called a shrine that was to commemorate George Washington and his life. And it was preserved by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. So they have managed to collect all the evidence possible. It's something that's going on today. If you find a new piece of evidence at Mount Vernon, call the MVLA, and they will come and help you out. But some very early images, the west front of the house in an early painting by Edward Savage, a view of the what was then quite new east front facing the Potomac River, a watercolor by Benjamin Henry Latrobe. Over the decades after the death of George Washington and Martha Washington, it remained in the family but was going downhill, and going downhill pretty rapidly. And so it was in the 1850s that Anne Pamela Cunningham of Charleston, South Carolina, began to advocate for preserving this. And that was at a time when the nation was roiled in controversy about slavery. The clouds of war were on the horizon. And at some times, Anne Pamela Cunningham imagined that restoring Mount Vernon would be a way of making people realize that we're all on the same side and that we're all Americans. Unfortunately, at other times, she was kind of a dyed-in-the-wool Confederate and really sort of saw this as it would be a monument to George Washington, but also to a pre-industrial time before the evil Yankees took over with all their factories and overwhelmed us with their force. That turned out to be not a good fundraising strategy for northern states, so she really had to do kind of a quick backtrack on that. No, really. We're talking about, this is the whole, Washington was the founder of the whole country, not just a representative of the South. So it's interesting seeing the challenges that underwent that. And here are the first regents of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association on that east portico. Anne Pamela, do you see the bust of Washington there? He's sort of center right, surrounded by all the ladies. And just over, sitting down, that's Anne Pamela Cunningham. And so she was the person who really, kind of by sheer grit and just knocking heads together, was able to acquire the estate for a private foundation because the state government was unwilling to take it. That's not our Constitution. We can't do that. The federal government was unwilling, uninterested in taking it over. It was something that had never been done before. They had just gotten around to authorizing the Smithsonian as a sort of semi-public, semi-private institution. And so there were very few museums, and the notion of preserving a historic site just did not exist yet. So Anne Pamela Cunningham really kind of set the table here. And as she was doing that, it was really, on a patriotic basis, and the people who were running the show, this was something that a group of very wealthy women were doing out of the goodness of their heart. It was not in the early days terribly professional. And so there's that's one reason why Colonial Williamsburg Foundation is such a big step in the 1920s, is that, John D. Rockefeller, the junior, is basically go out and hire me some architects, go out and hire me some businessmen who can do the business side of it. He's putting together a team, And so it's all male. And so it's a sort of a dramatic step away from the Mount Vernon way of thinking about things. But it's come back to where, Mount Vernon today is a highly professional organization. So that is to say, the MVLA has evolved along with the times. But just to give you images of a very early photograph of the shrine, this is the new room, the large dining room that George added after the Revolution, and with various and sundry exhibits. And that's the way that it looks in more recent times, based on intensive restoration, microscopic paint analysis, just very intensive research. So that the Mount Vernon today is really one of the cutting edge institutions in terms of historic preservation in the 21st century. So this is one of the grandest rooms in the house. At the opposite end, Washington added another wing on the south that has his office or study on the ground floor, and then a private bedchamber for him and Martha immediately above it. And so there's an 1835 painting there showing the room where Washington died. And I mean, that it was a thing. It was just that important to people. This is a relatively recent photograph, although they've been doing very intensive research into George and Martha's bedchamber. So if you go to Mount Vernon today, you'll see improvements on this as well. Mount Vernon, of course, is completely bound up in America's original sin, the sin of slavery. And that's been acknowledged, perhaps sentimentalized, as early, this is a painting by Eastman Johnson from 1864. The war was still going on, but a painting of Washington's kitchen with a woman, almost certainly enslaved, and a little child sitting next to her, also enslaved and having nothing to look forward to but a life of slavery. The promise of the American Revolution, people who were enslaved might hope, would lead ultimately to their freedom, but it took a cataclysmic civil war to have that happen. For most of the 19th and 20th century, Anne Pamela's sort of rah-rah Confederacy mentality prevailed at Mount Vernon, but it has now become more, attempting to become a much more inclusive organization. So what you're seeing on the image, this might be AI or computer generated, which is to say, it's an image of the new exhibit on slavery at Mount Vernon. And they're doing lots of archaeology and finding all sorts of information about the people who lived enslaved there and what their lives were like. So things have changed a great deal in that regard in terms of the professionalization of the staff and also attempting to tell the full story of America. Another very important early restoration, Paul Revere's house. Oh my God, we're back to Paul Revere. And this is in the north end of Boston, which in the later 19th century had become a very Italian neighborhood, much to the disdain of the old Bostonians. And in fact, you can't really see it. Well, maybe, can you read the sign between the second and third floor and the picture on the left side there? It's the Banca Italiana. So, believe it or not, that was Paul Revere's house being used as a bank for the Italian citizens of the North End. In the beginning of the 20th century, it was discovered that there's a pretty fair amount of fabric from Paul Revere's time and from even earlier. And so what you're seeing there is the house as it was restored, somewhat like the Capitol in Williamsburg. They decided, well, we have enough to take it back to the way it looked in the 1670s. Paul Revere bought the house in 1780, so he may have never seen it looking like this. So it's kind of a strange thing where here are two postcard images of the way it looked in 1909, just after it had been restored. And then here's the way that it looks today. And like Mount Vernon, like a lot of other historic sites, what was initially offered as being an accurate interpretation of Paul Revere's domestic space turned out to be, it was a good guess for the time, but no. So that a whole lot of work has gone into basically the ground floor parlor, and then, which is interpreted as 1670s, but then immediately above it, the bedchamber is Paul Revere's, and very much furnished like it would be in the 1770s or 1780s. Or another founding mother, Betsy Ross. There is actually an excellent book about Betsy Ross by Marla R. Miller. If you haven't read it, take a look at it because it's quite interesting. She's a very famous figure, one of the most famous women associated with the American Revolution. And famous quite specifically for her claim that she sewed the American flag, the first American flag, for George Washington and the Committee of Gentlemen from the Continental Congress. And Marla Miller is a very substantial biography of a figure that, believe it or not, there's never been a full-length bio of Betsy Ross. And it turns out that there's virtually no evidence that this meeting happened or that George Washington and committee asked her to do this or the like. But what is true is that Betsy Ross was an upholsterer and a seamstress, and that she actually, during the war and after, did produce a lot of flags, not just the sort of big national flag, but regimental flags that, in a time before walkie-talkies or cell phones or anything, troops were communicating by the flags, and so you could see where this group was going, where this regiment was going, and the like. So it was a very important part of military operations. And Betsy Ross did a lot of that in the Revolution, but especially for the War of 1812. So she's this interesting early businesswoman in America. So it's kind of ironic that she ends up being celebrated for one flag when it was actually a much more complicated story. And this may have been her house, or her house may have been next door. But apparently the staff of the Betsy Ross house has embraced the complexity of the story and tries to tell Betsy's whole story. Another very early founding father house, Monticello. This is a view of 2017, which was acquired in the 1920s, and again, it's the same tale of professionalization and increasing dedication to doing research to get the house right, to have it look like it looked in Jefferson's time and the time of his family. And so you get all sorts of things like the entry hall on the left and the parlor on the right. And this is actually new. If you haven't been in the last 5 years or so, these chromium yellow walls, woo, they pop. And this is apparently the way that Thomas Jefferson had it in his time. Quite remarkable. Up to the north, the birthplace of John Adams and John Quincy Adams and their houses still stands in Quincy, Massachusetts, south of Boston. And so this is the John Adams birthplace, which was actually purchased by his father, who was a deacon in the church in Quincy, and where his son, John Quincy Adams, was born. So between the two, and this is actually John Quincy Adams' birthplace. So two houses side by side, and it's sort of, we kind of have a comparable here in Texas when you think about the Texas Historical Commission, the Bush family state historic site. I always forget, is that Midland or Odessa? But you have the starter house of George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush and their kids, and it's also growing up place for George W. Bush. And just this one simple house, which is now a state historic site, which is pretty cool. To finish up, the story expands to Texas in the 19th century. In the 20th century, one of the very earliest attempts to restore a house is Sam Houston's Woodland home in Huntsville. And this was a house of 1847, 1848. A group of ornery students from what's now Sam Houston State University came up with the idea of saving what was left of the house, which had been moved, enlarged, turned into a boarding house for students from the university. The poor thing had been through a lot. So they ended up, the students and the faculty were able to raise the funds. They even got William Jennings Bryan to come and give an oration, which raised a lot of money to buy the house. And I believe that the university actually still owned the property. So they were able to move the house almost back to where it was. And so you're seeing the earliest photo of the house on the left, and then the log kitchen, the main house, and the log law office of Sam Houston, and that pretty little lake in a colored postcard of the 1930s. And by 1929, the Chamber of Commerce in Huntsville had decided that this was the Mount Vernon of Texas. So they're quite explicitly framing this as analogous to Mount Vernon and what had been done by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. So Texans were taking that as a model. And the same thing has happened there. That it was kind of quick. Let's get this done as quickly as we can. Not that much documentation done on it, but it has continued to professionalize, and now it's part of the Sam Houston Memorial Museum in Huntsville, so that there's a standalone museum building. But there's the Woodland Home. There's also the Steamboat House, which is even less well documented than this. But that's another lecture completely. But this is a very, very important early example of restoration. And, oftentimes you hear Sam Houston analogized as the George Washington of Texas, the soldier, the general who becomes the president of the Republic of Texas. After World War II, there was a huge outburst of economic growth. The Great Depression was finally over. America and allies had won World War II. And in the late 1940s and 1950s, you begin to get a number of important early historic preservation projects in Texas. So what you're seeing top left is the Ezekiel Cullen House in San Augustine. If you go any further, you're in Louisiana. Which in 1952 was restored by Rayford Stripling, an architect from San Augustine. And so the earliest photo of the house on the top, and then the house pretty much today to the bottom. And then on the right, another, and that was done for the local Daughters of the Republic of Texas group. The statewide Daughters of the Republic of Texas ended up acquiring the French legation in Austin. And so what you're seeing there is the painting by Julia Robertson, age 12, when not long after her family had purchased the house. And then it was restored by the DRT. Under the president of the DRT was a Waco woman named Margaret Barclay McGarity. And she was really a force of nature and sort of grab people and knock them by the heads if they're not moving fast enough for her. So she was the one, she ran for president of the DRT, and basically her campaign slogan was, "Finish the damn legation." And so, they had been puttering around for like 5, 6, 7 years, and so she got Rayford Stripling to come from San Augustine, and he restored the house. And so, by golly, they were able to get this thing open in 1956. So she knocked it together, and it happened. Rayford came back 10 years later and recreated the kitchen, which is not a very, from modern viewpoint, it's a very romantic, huge kitchen, much more than would have been there in 1840-41. But it's a good place for display of artifacts and the like. So these are two very important early restoration projects. But out in Fredericksburg, the Gillespie County Historical Society acquired the Kamala House, which you're seeing on the left there, a remarkable, very early house. They had owned this property from the 1840s and built the front house around 1854-55. And then the Steves house, the Steves homestead, in San Antonio in the King William Historic District. This is one of the things that makes it a historic district, is tremendous Victorian houses like this. Ed and Johanna Steves were a couple of German immigrants, lived for a while in New Braunfels and in Comfort, ended up settling in San Antonio, and Ed founds a very successful lumber company. And it's still going today. You can buy your lumber. And in fact, an exhibit has just opened at the Whitty Museum about the Steves family in San Antonio. So next time you're in San Antonio, you can take a look at that. So this was acquired by the San Antonio Conservation Society in 1952, actually given by a granddaughter of the Steveses. Opened as a museum in 1954, and it was a historic house museum until 2022, where the organization, the Conservation Society, has struggled, and they ended up selling this to a wealthy individual who has in turn struggled to restore it or adapt it. So kind of a strange situation of where we are now. You get restorations in Houston. Anybody been to Sam Houston Park in Houston, which is the home of the Heritage Society in Harris County? The earliest photo of the Kellum Noble House, upper left. The way it looked in the 1930s, lower left. That is on its original site, and it's the oldest remaining house in Houston. On the right, the upper one is the Nichols Rice Cherry House. The Rice is like William Marsh Rice, the wealthy merchant and real estate investor who left his fortune to the Rice Institute, which is now Rice University. So that was originally downtown, was moved out to Montrose, which is where this photo was taken by the Historic American Building Survey in, well, I don't know if this photo's from the 30s, it could be any time up to 1956, because it was moved to Sam Houston Park. So it's on site number 3, but they've done a very nice job of restoring that house. And then Miss Ima Hogg, who you may know as the daughter of Governor James Stephen Hogg. The Hogg family had purchased a plantation, the Varner-Patton Plantation in West Columbia. And so basically it was their weekend getaway while former Governor Hogg was being a lawyer in Houston and trying to make some money. She ended up restoring this and giving it to the state of Texas, to what's now Texas Parks and Wildlife. It's now a state historic site operated by the Texas Historical Commission. And so it's really kind of a challenge because, you know, her fingerprints, the way that she restored it really kind of affects the story still. So that, you know, sometimes the well-meaning, you know, it's as if Anne Pamela Cunningham was still driving the train at Mount Vernon. That Miss Ima, God bless her for all that she did for historic preservation and material culture in Texas. But there are some real challenges with this site. But that is the context completely for the beginnings of historic preservation in Waco. That here you see 2 of the earliest restorations. The Ford House on the left, built for William Ford and Dionysia Ford, built 1868-69, which was purchased by the Junior League in 1956. They tried making it a tea house. That rarely works. And so it ended up being given to the Waco Society for Historic Preservation. Eric alluded to the groups that came together to form the Historic Waco Foundation, and this was one of them. And then the Earl Napier Kennard House. The earliest part, the very far left part of that, where the chimney is, presumably being from before the Civil War, but most of the rest of the house being from 1869, 1870, something like that, finished by the Napier family. And this was purchased by Frances Duncan Nall, and it had only been lived in by the Earl Napier and the Kennard families, and the 2 Kennard girls passed away in the 1940s and early 50s. And so no one had a chance to really screw it up very much. So that turned out to be a good thing. Because of the financial issues of Historic Waco, and also just the dwindling attendance, the Ford House ended up being sold to Chip and Joanna Gaines, who, that was before the pandemic, and they ended up, I don't know what the arrangement is, but it's now Live Oak Academy, Live Oak Classical School owns it, and so apparently they're going to be adapting that for office space for some of their staff. So these two are early preservation projects that were right in line with all of these other preservation projects in San Antonio, and Fredericksburg, and Austin, and San Augustine. And not too far behind, you have East Terrace being acquired by the Young Brothers Contractors. They acquired this in 1959. And the next year it was given to the Heritage Society of Waco. So yet another early Waco group. After the merger, the McCullough House was acquired by the Historic Waco Foundation. And so those were the four that were sort of the high water mark of restoring historic houses for historic house museums. And it's entirely possible to beautifully and accurately restore houses and still have them be residences, or to have them, be bed and breakfast, or, not everything is going to become a museum. So we kind of have to be intentional when we're thinking about that. Sort of the last big gesture of Livonia Jenkins Barnes, Mrs. Bobby Barnes, and her friend Nell Pape, was to acquire the Earl Harrison House, which most of you know as being out by Cameron Park between 4th and 5th Street. But the original location of this was basically where the drive-through for In-N-Out Burger is, right at 4th Street and I-35. And and we can't blame In-N-Out. Basically, In-N-Out, that whole shopping mall, shopping center, is where the Clarion Hotel was. And basically this was moved to save it from being demolished for the Clarion Hotel. So it had actually been converted into apartments, not very elegantly converted into apartments. And this was a house where, there were not a lot of modern utilities in it. And so basically, Nell Pape had told Bobby Barnes that she would buy and restore any house in Waco that she, Mrs. Barnes, wanted. And this is what they settled on. And so you see on the left this poor forlorn picture. This might be by Dan Reif, who was the first art historian at Baylor back in the 60s. And it was, they brought in Rayford Stripling once again, and he did work on some of the other historic Waco houses. So it connects to San Augustine. It connects to the French legation in Austin. And by golly, he supervised the restoration of this house. And I know that Eric is dreaming that at some time in the near future, we can actually have a room exhibiting this bold move that was made by Bobby Barnes and Nell Pape, and talking about Waco's part in the historic preservation movement in Texas, because Waco was in on the game very early. And in fact, Rayford Stripling went on to restore Ashton Villa in Galveston, a great early Victorian house. And so this is not like the last gasp of historic preservation by any stretch of the imagination. Waco was right with the times in this attempt to appreciate the historic heritage of the community. And so all of that, all of the things that were happening here were coming about because of the efforts of earlier generations, many earlier generations, to restore and remember the American Revolution in places in Boston and in Quincy, in Williamsburg and in Richmond, and in Philadelphia, where so much of it happened. So an interesting story, and it's an ongoing story. And thank you for your support of Historic Waco. If you're not a member, be sure to sign up, because there are cool places that we can take this organization, and cool things that we can tell people about, and all the visitors that have started to come to Waco. we can make it another good reason to come to Waco over and above the silence. Thank you all.
Do we have any questions before we go get some snacks?
Probably the main question is, what's for snacks? Is that a question over there?
Yes. How many years did Rayford Stripling work on? I mean, what was his span of?
As a restoration architect?
Yes.
He was an early graduate of the architecture program at Texas A&M. He was a proud Aggie all the way through, I'm sorry to say. One of his earliest jobs was actually a New Deal project to essentially reconstruct the mission at Goliad. And so he was kind of learning, you know, the hard way. So he's a young architect learning to become a preservationist in the 1930s, really becomes like the expert on St. Augustine, and in addition to the Cullen House, there are several other early Greek revival houses, some of the earliest Greek revival houses in Texas, but then expands with the Legation and with Ashton Villa, and Ashton Villa is like 1969 to 73, something like that. Things sort of calmed down for him after that, but in the 80s there was an exhibit at the Institute for Texan Cultures celebrating him. And at that point, there was a book published, a commission, but Michael McCullough, who was the architectural critic at the Austin American Statesman, wrote a very nice biography of Rayford that was really, I think, sort of as told by Rayford about all the different projects that he worked on. So that's called Restoring Texas, if you want to see that. But Michael McCullough is the author of that.
So he spanned, what, about 50 years, 60 years?
Yeah, probably from 1934 to 1974. So I guess we could call that 40 years.
40 years.
But yeah, it was a good long run. Other questions? Thank you for that one. And you can always ask me questions while nibbling on a cookie or a sandwich or something like that. Once again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you again so much. I just want to go over the events we have for Historic Waco in 2026. So on May 9th, we were actually doing an Austin Avenue neighborhood parade of historic homes. It's an opportunity for you to go into one of the many historic homes we have in Austin Avenue that's owned by private hands, kind of get a preview tour of that. We also, on May 21st, are doing the Castillo Family Food Tour. This is a kind of a similar event we did a couple of years ago. Essentially, the Castillo family, they own La Fiesta. They've actually had a lot of different restaurants in Waco's history. So we'll get to hear a little bit about their history, Waco's food history, and you'll get to eat some of that food, which is always very exciting.
Yeah. Edible heritage.
Yes, exactly. Our fall lecture is going to be September 22nd, and this is actually going to be about the book Saronia, Texas, which ties in well with the murder mystery that we have September 25th and 26th, which is also, spoiler, about Saronia, Texas. So some of this information is on our website, some of that stuff I'll update as soon as I get some details locked out. But again, it's going to be exciting for Historic Waco. Thank you all so much for being here, and please go enjoy some refreshments.